third module, the beginning of our third module on liberalism, and I'm very pleased to say that this is certainly one of the topics that gets me most motivated in this subject. I'm a really interested party here, you might say. That's not because I consider myself a liberal. Actually, I think if any of you were to someday go and read some of the research that I've done or published, you'd find that probably my work goes off in quite a different direction to this, but that's for another day's discussion. But I am interested in liberalism. I'm interested in liberalism as a theory of international relations that challenges the notion that life goes on in a never-ending sort of cycle of events without change ever taking place. That is something that the Greeks seem to suggest to us, or at least as they've been interpreted to suggest through Thucydides and Waltz's reading of Thucydides, etc. One of the things we discussed in realism last week, the idea of the prisoner's dilemma, and we also discussed it through the metaphor of the stag hunt. This idea that if two parties or more believe that they are part of a zero-sum game, that my win is your loss, then there is a strong motivation on the part of those parties to defect from their promises to each other under conditions of anarchy. So again, this idea of a zero-sum game, it's pretty dismal, right? Or dismal. It's pretty cynical. And the question is, as we've put here on the slide, can the state the egoism of the state ever be truly overcome? And idealists, sometimes known as liberals, sometimes known as neoliberals, we don't want to get too much into that. We could, in fact, if we wanted to, just sort of stick with Cynthia Weber's nomenclature, and she uses the term idealism. I'm in the habit of using the term liberalism, so I'm sure that word will pop up or creep in there as I'm talking to you today. But at least you'll know that I'm using them interchangeably. Although I suppose in a more advanced class we would probably be eager to specify some of the differences and nuances between idealism and liberalism, because I don't think those terms are intended to be used the same way. So we've been talking about zero-sum games, and we've been talking about the idea that from a neo-realist perspective at least, that history doesn't really matter, that all that really matters is the never-ending cycle of interactions between these so-called billiard balls interacting within the system of international politics. And I hope, at least if nothing else, I hope that that's what came through clearly from our discussion of Cynthia Weber's analysis, from our interrogation of the movie Lord of the Flies. One of the things that we were at pains to emphasize was how there's another way of reading realism, a classical way or an older way of reading realism, that puts forward the idea that, no, maybe culture matters, maybe history matters. There are conditioning variables at work on other levels of the so-called image ladder that Waltz set up for us, first, second, third image of analysis. And with Waltz putting such a formal emphasis on the third image by the time of his later career, we'd be forgiven for thinking that none of these other things matter. Personal, individual psychology, fears, superstitions, things like that they have no place in our political analysis. But what the movie seemed to suggest was that, in fact, no, the conditions of anarchy were there from the get-go. Those permissive conditions were there, but the commitment of the boys and their sort of cultural attachment to the idea of their superiority, their Englishness, their sense that we're civilized, almost in a comic fashion, but certainly in a very real fashion, prevailed. And it wasn't, in fact, until the sort of irrational fear, as we've been calling it, of the beastie became very emphasized through their mutual shared declaration, through a vote, through the mechanism of a vote, that the beastie existed. And then, of course, Ralph and the other boys, not Simon, oh gosh, his name is escaping me at the moment, but I'll come back to it in a minute. They go up to the top of the hill and they discover that, in fact, the beast is very real. So, well, I mean, they're kids, so their superstitions are they're equally vulnerable to superstitions. But yes, the boys then pretty much that they are the last bulwark against the popular understanding among all the boys that that beasts exist. And so once that has happened, once that situation is materialized, then of course there's not much left to be done. The whole thing descends into pure chaos. So, what sort of response does neoliberalism, liberalism, and idealism put forward to that? Probably today we won't be talking about neoliberalism, but certainly we will start our thoughts with two things, I think, to keep in mind throughout the lecture. One is the importance of history and the importance of thinking about history and the fact that it can change who we are, how we think about ourselves, the story we tell ourselves about who we are, the song we're singing, if you want to go back to the first lecture, the introductory lecture. The idealist's second point, I think, would be in relation to this question of zero-sum games. If we have a zero-sum situation, then I am more interested in the question of what you have relative to me. But as we were discussing not that long ago, if we recall John McCain's argument in his campaign speech against Obama, one of the things that he was suggesting was that actually maybe a zero-sum game is not the best way to think about things. Social relations can also be understood in terms of growing the pie, right? So what he's saying there is just because my piece of the pie is bigger than yours doesn't mean that you can't be satisfied with a growing piece of your pie, because we can grow the pie. And this is the idea of relative gains. This is the idea of perhaps putting forward an alternative vision of how cooperation can be achieved in anarchy, where everyone's winning together. And we call this a positive sum scenario. So we're going to be trying to explore positive sum scenarios, and we're going to be trying to explore the fact that, historically speaking, not everyone has always sort of succumbed to the cynical wheel of history, the never-ending tragedy of history. So let's start by just talking about the Titanic, which is perhaps, you might say, a kind of a strange place to start, but it occurred to me there some time back. I was listening to an article on the radio, and they were talking about David Savage, who is a Australian behavioral economist, and he was talking about how you can tell a lot about how people relate to order in times of disaster. And the Titanic, of course, the metaphor, the image of the Titanic is very telling here in relation to this. The interesting thing about this example is that if you were British, you were 7% more likely to die in the Titanic. And what David Savage does is he has extended that analysis from the Titanic and looked at a number, a huge sort of number of shipping disasters where passenger liners were sinking. And he has found out that different nationalities, different cultures are more or less likely to sink. Different nationalities, different cultures are more or less likely to lose their lives in these disasters, depending on their attitudes to order and to rules. One of the things he observes, for example, is that Americans, especially in shipping disasters, seem to exhibit much more individualism. They are more individualistic people, where are more group-oriented. So the British would tend to form an orderly line and wait for their turn to get on the lifeboats. But of course, sadly, as we know in the Titanic, there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone. The Americans, on the other hand, being more individualistic, realized that their survival was at stake and were a lot less inclined to form an orderly line. And so they would push their way to the front. So that's an interesting thing. It tells us that perhaps culture matters, that institutions matter, and I think that's the focus we're going to sort of try to emphasize as we're moving forward in our lecture today. Why institutions matter, why people have different relationships to order, and so I guess what we're trying to say here at the end of the day is maybe to focus in on this term institutions for a second, because we when we hear the term institution, we think about the term institution of marriage, or we think about government institutions, in which case we think of bricks and mortar. But what does it really mean to speak of an institution? Well, an institution really is nothing more than a shared way of doing things, and a sort of a perhaps even unconsciously agreed upon way of doing things. The British believed in the Titanic disaster in forming an orderly queue, so they did, even though the stakes were very high, they performed a certain way, as their culture had sort of led them to believe they should. And so they believed that that was a rational way to proceed. The Americans just didn't in that instance. So it tells us perhaps that our expectations of the utility of institutions can be a factor in determining our behavior, even in a high-stakes scenario. And I, for one, think that that's a very interesting challenge to the discourse and the language of the realists that we've been looking at last week in the last module. So what are our goals this lecture? First of all, as we develop our theoretical language, we will pause to think about this thing called a common power problem. This is the core puzzle, if you will, of liberalism, and I want to take some time to think about that today. Second of all, I want to focus in on the key theories of classical liberalism. We have a couple of different strands that we can pick on to try to explore and understand why behaviors change in relation to institutions, and so I'll take some time to think about that with you. Thirdly, and I think this is hugely important vis-a-vis our Cynthia Weber reading for this week, we're going to focus in here, we must indeed, why do liberal states tend to have more peaceful relationships? What's going on in the world that liberals see, that realists don't see? What is this cultural difference? What are the opportunities that historical development seems to have thrown up for us that liberals really believe makes a difference? And then, having made that argument, we then focus in on the fourth point, which is, I think, Cynthia Weber in her chapter's sort of key focus, and this is what enables us to think about what we want to discuss for watching our movie. This is liberalism's post-Cold War myth, which is, of course, to do with what we call today globalization, but we'll want to take some time to be specific about what that myth is, and think about it in terms of its credibility for us, and perhaps whether we would imagine there's any flaws in it. What would a realist maybe respond to that? But indeed, I think all of these things will be apparent from Cynthia Weber's text as well. But in this lecture, I just want to sort of add elements 1 and 2 especially to her analysis, just so you have a bit of background, and that her chapter maybe will have a context for you to latch onto as you read. So let's talk about this common power problem. We have here on the slide, in the inset image here, the frontispiece, the famous frontispiece of Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, probably to this day the most famous text of political theory written in the English language. So what was Hobbes doing in this text that made it so famous, that has made it so resilient, its message so resilient throughout the passage of history? It is clear that Hobbes was living in a time when there was a lot of turmoil in the country he was living in. He was living in Civil War England, and Hobbes, it is clear, was not necessarily himself a monarchist, in the sense that he believed that there was a divine right of kings to be kings. He was not of a mind that any one human being was any somehow more special than another human being. But he did believe in order, and he did believe in government. And so whether it was through a king or a queen or a parliament, he didn't care. What he did believe was that there had to be what he called a Leviathan. Now, we've been discussing last week through realism the three S's. The idea of self-help, the idea of survival being sort of a motivator for us to pursue self-help. And one of the reasons that Hobbes would be useful for us here is in thinking about that first S, why nation-states are different to other groups. For Hobbes, people obviously will form groups for a variety of reasons, but in the state of nature, those groups are going to be short-lived because there is no common power. That is to say, there is no power overarching over all of us. You see here this image of the Leviathan coming over the hill. Take a close look at the image and see if you can figure out what the relationship of this image is to this thing called common power. Well, if you look closely, I don't know if you can see it on your YouTube here, but if you wanted to look up the image of this frontispiece on the web and study it in more detail yourselves, you would see that the body of the Leviathan is composed of a multitude of people. And so this was Hobbes's kind of metaphor for what he was talking about here, the body of the multitude acting as one. And how is that going to be achieved? How are you going to unify the common will of the people so that anarchy is overcome? For Hobbes, anarchy is a bitter, bitter condition, and it is something that really constrains human life. As he says here, it's probably the most famous quote in English-speaking world from political theory anyway. He says that in the state of nature, life is nasty, brutish, and short. And this again is a reminder of how anarchy lowers the human condition. He says that in anarchy there's no progress, there's no ability to navigate the world, to have comfort, to have luxury. And you know, obviously he was talking a long time before Max Weber gave us the definition that we were using of sovereignty, but he was well and truly aware, as you can see if you read him, that the way this anarchy should be overcome is to create this common power. But the question is how. For Hobbes, the myth that he creates, or the myth that he wants to lend credence to, is this idea that once upon a time, a long time ago, wise men were living in this state of nature, and they realized that this couldn't go on. They realized that they had to take a little bit of their power each and give it to one figure among them who would then have that power, that common power, and be able to wield it and use it over them in order to create peace, oddly, in order to create stability. This is the idea of transforming rather, that zero-sum game scenario that we were talking about in Anarchy, that prisoner's dilemma, where everyone was betraying each other and the promises they were making to each other, by giving up their power to a common to a sovereign, then that sovereign would be able to maintain order. But why, you might say, would the sovereign not become undermined by people? Well, the sovereign's power, this common power that's being invested in him, is in fact military power. It is the power to use armed violence, the power to use force. And because it is the power to use force, that power can therefore be used to intimidate, to cajole, to coerce the multitudes then into obedience. And in fact, it is the fear of losing one's life to that violence that in fact compels everyone to behave themselves. Now, you might say that's a very cynical notion, and I would agree with you, but it is very important for us historically, because the Leviathan is the first time, really, that we're seeing someone make this kind of argument for what Hobbes ultimately calls the social contract. And social contract theory is something that is very much at the heart of liberalism, even though I don't think Hobbes is a liberal. I think liberalism comes along a little bit later than Hobbes, more with people like Locke. But it is important to understand the mechanics of common power. It is important to understand that what Hobbes is putting in place is the idea that once upon a time there was a contract, and this contract, once it's in place, was enforced through coercive violence and the means of force, maintaining order there on an everyday basis thereafter. So that's really hugely important. Now, the question for us, really, if we were to put our liberal hats on, and of course, I should maybe pause here to note that, when I use the term liberal here, I'm not using it in a Glenn Beck sense. Glenn Beck uses the term liberalism in a kind of a pejorative sense. Glenn Beck wants to knock liberalism as a kind of a tree hugger, hippie, kind of utopian movement in America that's sort of trying to work towards socialism or something. That's not the liberalism we're talking about here at all. In fact, international relations liberalism is much more like classic early Enlightenment liberalism, and as such, it's much more like the liberalism that was the sort of philosophical basis of the Founding Fathers as they tried to establish the United States of America. So we shouldn't think about liberalism as being kind of Glenn Beck style liberalism here for a minute, because that's actually really unhelpful for us. So while we're just talking about Locke there, he comes along just a little bit later than Hobbes, and he was writing at the time of another conflict that was breaking out in England. This is the emergence of the sort of tension between Protestants and Catholics, and of course this is the time where James II is put out of power, and in comes William of Orange. But John Locke, observing some of these tensions in his society, was also convinced to ponder and reflect the basis of order. And there's a lot that we can say here about Locke. We know historically that he was very much a sort of a bourgeois figure, that he had a sort of a desire to see a greater place at the table for merchants and businessmen, and consequently then his theory can appear a little bit ideological, but on the other hand, as an evolution of the principle of liberalism that was sort of encased within Hobbes's writings, he is a very interesting figure, Locke, for us. So he took the basic idea of Locke's, he took the basic idea of Hobbes's theory, and this idea of a harmony perhaps being enforced by a common power. He took it very seriously. But on the other hand, he also believed that men, when left to their own devices, were capable of being rational enough in the state of nature, in anarchy, that they would basically keep to their own affairs, and only under the most arduous of circumstances prevail upon others violently. So Locke, in a way, had a much less dismal view of the state of nature. It's a kind of I have my patch of land, you have yours, I don't really care what you're doing over there so long as you leave me alone, kind of attitude. And it really, what you can see in that, I think, is the beginnings of a sort of a positive sum game as opposed to a zero sum game scenario that Hobbes was talking about. So you might say, why have a government at all then if anarchy seems to work so well for Locke? Well, what he's basically suggesting is that Leviathan, where Leviathan's purpose, Hobbes's Leviathan, the purpose of it was to intimidate people and keep them in line through fear. Locke doesn't think that fear is really necessary. Men most of the time get along fine, but there are men who are who will be lazy, who will try to take the easy option, who will try to exploit what we call today in economics the free rider problem. Who just won't pay their fare on the bus, so to speak, right? These are the people who believe in a free lunch. I guess I would say in a popular parlance. And Locke realizes this problem, this free rider problem exists, and so a commonwealth as opposed to Leviathan is his solution. And commonwealth is basically an arbitration system. It is a court system that has duties not to intrude on people's property, but to protect people's property. to protect their life and to protect their prosperity. And so he says here in the bubble quote, "The great and chief end, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property." This is a much more limited form of government. This is government that has much less in terms of a right to mess around in people's affairs, domestically speaking. And so in a way it's a much more ambitious project, and we can say that, basically at the kernel of what Locke's putting forward here is liberalism. So now we've talked about this liberalism as perhaps having an effect or an impact domestically within a country, but of course the question is how to achieve that internationally. Is there a way that we can get positive sum game scenarios playing out internationally? Well, from Locke's point of view, in theory at least, it should be possible, right? Why wouldn't those? After all, we're already used to thinking about nation states as being kind of like people too. We know from Hobbes and from subsequently from Locke, we can conjecture that Locke would agree with Hobbes that there's kind of a corporate personhood to the nation state. And we know the realists already thought of the nation state as having a kind of a corporate personhood because they act as one, don't they? And why do they act as one? Because they have their survival at stake. And sadly, because of anarchy, say the realists, they must engage in self-help. But maybe that's where the liberals would digress, because they would say, if you could create institutions, or if you could create domestic-like structures internationally, that desire to survive on the part of the S, we'd still have our first two S's, the state and the survival, but we wouldn't necessarily have self-help, because self-help would be not necessary or unnecessary if you were able to domesticate international relations to a certain extent. So I guess we'll have to see what they have to say in the next slide. Here's the dilemma, right? And we're trying to set this up because we're trying to flesh out some of the distinctions between what we were talking about earlier on, the sort of more Glenn Beck style liberalism, and the idea of an international relations liberalism. On the inset here, you can see some information which points out to us really where the problem begins from the Glenn Beck liberalism perspective, right? Because obviously domestic liberalism has been around for a long time, and it's so entrenched now, people are in the habit of living with it. They've been negotiating with it for a long time. There's been struggles of marginalized peoples for rights throughout the years, and so you can say we sort of live in an advanced liberal age at the moment, if you like. And I'm sure there's people who challenge that, by the way, but if we take the premise, then we live in an advanced liberal age. And we see that our discussion of liberalization of our society sort of splits off into two different branches, and this is kind of where we get in trouble. On the one hand, we have what the philosopher Isaiah Berlin calls negative freedom. That is the freedom from arbitrary authority. Now, this is very much like Lockean liberalism. We were just talking about Locke and the preservation that we have come to expect from the preservation that we have come to expect from the sovereign. The sovereign is a self-limiting sovereign, and our demands of this self-limiting sovereign have grown historically, haven't they? So many liberal regimes today treasure, for example, the principles of self-government where possible, freedom from arbitrary power, which includes your basic rights like habeas corpus, which is your right to a free trial. Every American, it is said, has the right to free trial should they be detained by the police force, for example. The freedom of conscience is very important as well, to think what you want to think, freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom to have your property secure. So that's all very sort of recognizable to us, and we can see the origins of that in the previous slide when we were talking about John Locke. Where I think we get into trouble, sort of more from the Glenn Beck side of things, is that liberalism today has also developed a sort of a second wing, and that is to do with freedom from a social and economic rights perspective. What we call this positive freedom, again using Isaiah Berlin's nomenclature. And this includes a different type of freedom. It's not freedom from, but it's freedom to. It includes rights like enablement, welfare, opportunity, rights to healthcare, employment. Now, obviously for a lot of people those are kind of controversial, but many people would suggest, and the classic liberals were not immune to talking about this kind of freedom. If you were to take my political theory class, I would show you that many of the liberals that were in the early days, like C. Wright Mills, excuse me, I didn't mean to say C. Wright Mills, I meant to say J.S. Mill, excuse me. You can see already within J.S. Mill, a sort of a more later liberal, but contemporary of Marx, who would have put forward, not from a Marxist perspective, but just from a standard liberal perspective, the idea that these positive freedoms are very relevant and important for a society because just think about it in terms of the utility of that society. How many great composers, how many great scientists have we lost simply because of the trap of poverty that people cannot escape? And isn't it a great idea for all of us to be able to reap the benefits of their brains if those people could finally have an education and have their capacities, their raw capacities, if you will, to be a great scientist or a great artist or what have you, enabled, switched on, as it were, through a process of education, and to have them physically healthy and robust, with shoes on their feet and that kind of thing. So those are the two sort of splits within domestic liberalism that we need to contend with. And of course there's a third one, which is how that all should be represented. And it's said that representation is the sort of the key thing that secures the other two, domestically speaking. So that's fine. But once we agree on that, once we have that established, and we can sort of agree to disagree about how much freedom there should be in terms of a negative or a positive sense and what the trade-offs are there. But when it comes to international liberalism, we're not at that stage yet. You can see elements of that debate existing internationally, but we're really not at that stage yet. We're still, many liberals would say, much further back. We're still back at that sort of Hobbesian stage, where there's a lot of common power leakage, so to speak. And the question really that the liberals are trying to raise is how to sort of minimize that leakage. I'm going to pause the video here and call that part 1, and we'll be back in just a moment with part 2. Thanks, guys.